Thousands of years ago, long before satellites filled the skies, before nations possessed nuclear weapons, and before the modern world became obsessed with technology and power, a man stood in the middle of a troubled civilization and delivered warnings that still unsettle humanity today. His name was Isaiah. Most people know Isaiah as an ancient biblical prophet, but the deeper you study his writings, the more disturbing they become. Because Isaiah did not merely speak about his own generation, he described trembling nations, collapsing pride, fear spreading across humanity, and a world shaken by instability. Some of his descriptions feel astonishingly modern. When people think about end times prophecy, they usually focus on Revelation, the four horsemen, or the teachings of Jesus about the last days. But Isaiah contains some of the most cinematic and terrifying prophetic imagery in the entire Bible. He described the earth shaking. He described humanity hiding in fear. He described nations consumed by chaos. He described people becoming spiritually blind while danger quietly approached. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how closely his warnings resemble the emotional atmosphere of today's world. Modern society feels increasingly unstable. Wars erupt unexpectedly. Economic fear spreads rapidly. Political tensions divide nations. People are emotionally exhausted. Humanity has more technology than ever before, yet somehow feels more uncertain than ever. Could Isaiah have seen something beyond his own era? That question becomes even more fascinating when you realize how many of Isaiah's prophecies were fulfilled with remarkable precision throughout history. Entire kingdoms he warned about eventually collapsed exactly as he described. Empires that once appeared invincible disappeared into history. Which raises another uncomfortable possibility. What if some of Isaiah's warnings were never fully completed? What if parts of his visions point toward humanity's future? Isaiah repeatedly described something called the Day of the Lord, a terrifying period associated with judgment, fear, destruction, and the humbling of humanity. It was not presented as an ordinary war. It was described as a global shaking, a moment when human pride collapses, a moment when nations tremble, a moment when people suddenly realize their systems cannot save them. That imagery sounds disturbingly Armageddonic. But perhaps the most chilling part of Isaiah's warnings was not the destruction itself. It was humanity's blindness. Again and again, Isaiah described people refusing to listen, people becoming spiritually numb, people continuing life normally while danger quietly approached. And maybe that is what makes these prophecies feel so relevant today. Because modern humanity is deeply distracted. People scroll endlessly through social media while wars escalate. They chase entertainment while instability spreads. They seek comfort while the world becomes increasingly uncertain. Isaiah warned that spiritual blindness would become one of humanity's greatest weaknesses. But what exactly did Isaiah see? Did he truly describe something resembling the end times, or are modern readers simply connecting patterns that were never intended? That question becomes even harder to ignore once we begin examining Isaiah's descriptions of trembling nations, because they sound far more modern than most people realize. Isaiah's warnings were never limited to isolated events. He described entire nations shaking under pressure. He described societies overwhelmed with fear. He described humanity entering periods of instability so intense that even the strongest kingdoms would begin trembling. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how familiar this atmosphere feels today. The modern world operates under constant tension. Wars and rumors of wars dominate headlines. Economies feel fragile. Political division grows deeper. Fear spreads globally in minutes through technology and media. Humanity has become more connected than ever before, yet emotionally fractured at the same time. Isaiah repeatedly warned about this kind of instability. He described nations filled with pride suddenly becoming weak. He described leaders losing control. He described societies consumed by fear and confusion. Some of his imagery feels larger than ancient warfare. It almost feels global. He spoke about people hiding in terror. He described humanity trembling before overwhelming events. Today, fear spreads faster than ever before. One major conflict can affect the entire world emotionally within hours. One economic crisis can destabilize millions of lives instantly. One war can reshape global politics. The modern world appears powerful, but it is also incredibly fragile, and many people can feel it. Even those who are not religious often describe feeling uneasy about the future. Why? Because the world feels increasingly unstable. People no longer trust systems the way they once did. Institutions appear weaker. Alliances feel temporary. Economic stability feels uncertain. Could Isaiah have been describing this kind of atmosphere? That possibility becomes even more disturbing when we look at the Middle East. There is something unique about the Middle East. For thousands of years, empires have fought over it. Religions emerged from it. Civilizations rose and fell around it. Despite modern advancement, the region remains one of the most unstable places on Earth. Why does the entire world constantly watch this region? Why do global powers repeatedly become involved there? The answer may be deeper than politics. Biblically, the Middle East sits at the center of prophetic history. Jerusalem alone carries enormous spiritual significance for billions of people. Throughout Scripture, nations surrounding this region repeatedly appear in prophecies involving conflict, judgment, restoration, and the future of humanity. Isaiah spoke extensively about nations surrounding Israel and Jerusalem. He described tensions. He described judgment upon kingdoms. He described future instability that would shake nations. What is fascinating is that despite thousands of years passing, the region remains intensely volatile. Peace agreements come and go, wars erupt repeatedly, temporary stability collapses, global powers continue positioning themselves around the area. This ongoing cycle creates an uncomfortable question. Could the instability itself be prophetically significant? Many biblical scholars believe the Middle East serves as a prophetic stage where larger spiritual and geopolitical patterns unfold. Even people who are not religious often sense that events there carry unusual global importance. One major conflict in the region can affect energy markets, economies, military strategies, and international alliances almost immediately. That level of influence is extraordinary. But perhaps the most disturbing part is how normalized this instability has become. People expect tension there. People almost speak about war in the region as though it is inevitable. Maybe that expectation itself reveals something. Isaiah repeatedly warned about cycles of unrest. He described nations trapped in patterns of pride, conflict, and instability. Yet humanity continues believing permanent peace is just one agreement away. But what if the deeper problems are spiritual? What if humanity keeps trying to solve symptoms while ignoring the deeper condition underneath? That possibility becomes even more unsettling when we observe how often temporary peace collapses. Again and again, leaders announce breakthroughs. Again and again, the world celebrates diplomacy. And again, conflict returns. Isaiah may have hinted at the answer. According to his warnings, humanity's greatest problem was not merely political, it was spiritual blindness, pride, corruption, and separation from God. And if those deeper problems remain unresolved, then perhaps no human system can create lasting peace. Which brings us to one of the most disturbing patterns in modern history, the illusion of peace.
Every generation believes peace has finally arrived. Leaders sign agreements, diplomats celebrate breakthroughs, the media speaks about hope, and for a brief moment, people begin to relax. Then suddenly, everything changes again. Conflict returns, tensions rise, fear spreads. The cycle repeats. This pattern has become especially common in the Middle East. Temporary ceasefires create optimism. Negotiations produce hopeful headlines. Nations publicly commit themselves to stability, yet somehow the peace never lasts. Why? Why does humanity repeatedly fail to maintain lasting peace? Isaiah's writings may provide a disturbing answer. Throughout his prophecies, he warned about false confidence. He warned about humanity trusting fragile systems. He warned about people believing temporary calm meant lasting security. But according to Isaiah, the deeper problems were never truly solved. Pride remained, violence remained, spiritual corruption remained, human ambition remained. Perhaps that is why peace repeatedly collapses. Humanity often treats peace as merely the absence of visible conflict, but biblical prophecy suggests true peace requires something much deeper, transformation of the human heart. Without that transformation, temporary calm simply delays future chaos. Modern history seems to prove this pattern repeatedly. Nations become stronger militarily, technology becomes more advanced, diplomacy becomes more sophisticated, yet humanity continues producing instability. Why? Because external progress does not automatically solve internal corruption. Isaiah repeatedly warned about the danger of trusting appearances. He described societies that looked stable, while deeper problems quietly intensified underneath. That sounds remarkably modern. Today, the world often appears functional on the surface. Cities operate normally, economies continue moving, technology advances rapidly, entertainment distracts billions of people. Yet beneath the surface, many people sense growing instability, emotional exhaustion, political division, fear of the future, distrust, spiritual emptiness. The modern world is highly connected, yet increasingly anxious. Perhaps the illusion of peace is one of the most dangerous aspects of modern society, because temporary stability creates spiritual complacency. People stop paying attention. They assume the future will continue normally. They ignore warning signs because life still appears manageable. Isaiah repeatedly warned about exactly this type of blindness, and maybe that blindness becomes most dangerous when humanity feels safest, because according to biblical prophecy, sudden disruption often arrives unexpectedly. Civilizations rarely believe collapse is possible before instability begins accelerating. Once instability spreads, fear grows rapidly. That is why Isaiah's warnings feel so unsettling today. He described humanity living confidently while danger quietly approached. And if that pattern is repeating now, then the next question becomes deeply important. What happens when powerful nations become consumed by pride? Isaiah repeatedly warned about pride, not ordinary confidence, but the kind of pride that makes nations believe they are untouchable, the kind of pride that convinces civilizations they no longer need God. Perhaps no generation has embodied that mindset more than the modern world. Humanity has become incredibly advanced. Artificial intelligence, nuclear weapons, global surveillance, digital economies, and military technology have transformed civilization.
Modern society often behaves as though technology guarantees control. But Isaiah warned that pride creates blindness. History proves this repeatedly. Every empire believed it was secure before it collapsed. Babylon believed its walls made it invincible. Rome believed its influence would last forever. Powerful kingdoms throughout history assumed they controlled their destiny, until suddenly everything changed. Isaiah repeatedly described proud nations being humbled. He warned that human arrogance eventually leads to instability. Today, global tensions increasingly reflect that pattern. Nations compete for dominance, leaders threaten each other publicly, military power continues expanding, countries race to strengthen their economic and technological influence. Yet despite all this advancement, the world feels less peaceful. Why? Because power alone cannot create stability. Perhaps humanity's obsession with control is actually increasing global fragility. Modern warfare is more dangerous than ever before. One large-scale conflict could affect the entire planet. Economic systems are deeply interconnected. Supply chains are vulnerable. Political tensions spread rapidly. Fear travels instantly through digital media. Civilization appears powerful, but it is also extremely delicate. Isaiah repeatedly warned that pride prevents humanity from recognizing this fragility. People trust systems more than wisdom. They trust technology more than discernment. They trust political solutions more than spiritual transformation. But Isaiah described humanity eventually reaching a point where its own systems could no longer provide security. That imagery sounds disturbingly Armageddonic. A world filled with powerful nations, a world driven by pride, a world moving toward confrontation. And perhaps that confrontation is not only military, perhaps it is spiritual. According to Isaiah, humanity's greatest problem was never simply external conflict, it was internal corruption. Maybe that explains why modern society feels increasingly unstable despite all its advancement. People are emotionally exhausted. Fear spreads rapidly. Division intensifies. Spiritual clarity becomes harder to maintain. Which raises another deeply important question. What if the greatest danger in the last days is not war itself, but distraction? What if the greatest danger is distraction? Isaiah repeatedly warned about people who could no longer see clearly, people who ignored warnings, people whose hearts became spiritually numb. Modern society reflects that condition almost perfectly. Humanity has never been more distracted. People scroll endlessly through social media. Entertainment never stops. Technology constantly demands attention. While the world grows increasingly unstable, many people remain emotionally numb. That numbness is dangerous because spiritual blindness rarely happens suddenly. It develops slowly. People become desensitized. They normalize chaos. They adapt to instability. Eventually, warning signs no longer feel alarming. Isaiah described societies exactly like this: people hearing truth without listening, people seeing signs without understanding, people continuing ordinary life while deeper problems intensified. Wars escalate, fear spreads, division grows, yet many continue behaving as though nothing significant is happening. Modern technology intensifies this blindness. The digital world constantly distracts people from reflection. Endless information floods the mind without producing wisdom. Fear and distraction work together. Once people become overwhelmed enough, survival becomes their primary focus. And when survival becomes the focus, spiritual clarity begins fading. That may be one of the enemy's greatest strategies, not necessarily destroying humanity physically, but keeping humanity spiritually asleep. Distracted people rarely recognize warning signs. Isaiah repeatedly warned about people ignoring the signs around them.
Many sense something is wrong. They feel instability. They feel anxiety. They feel uncertainty. But instead of seeking truth, they seek comfort, more entertainment, more noise, more distraction, anything to avoid confronting uncomfortable questions. But Isaiah's prophecies force humanity to confront those questions. What happens if civilization continues drifting further from spiritual truth? What happens if humanity becomes too blind to recognize danger? Perhaps most importantly, what if Isaiah's most terrifying visions were describing something still ahead? Because this is where Isaiah's imagery becomes truly apocalyptic. He described trembling earth, darkened skies, humanity consumed by fear, nations collapsing, people hiding in terror. The descriptions sound astonishingly Armageddonic. Whether symbolic or literal, the emotional atmosphere of those prophecies feels disturbingly relevant today.
Modern humanity already lives under growing tension. People fear war. People fear collapse. People fear uncertainty. People fear the future. Isaiah warned that humanity's fear would eventually intensify dramatically. This is where Isaiah's prophecy becomes terrifying, because some of his imagery sounds almost apocalyptic. He described the earth shaking. He described the heavens trembling. He described humanity overwhelmed by fear. He described destruction so intense that people would hide in terror. The language feels enormous, almost cosmic. Many readers throughout history have wondered whether Isaiah was describing more than ordinary historical events. Could these visions point toward the final stages of human instability? That possibility becomes difficult to ignore when you examine how intense his imagery becomes. Isaiah described fire, darkness, devastation, nations collapsing, widespread fear, and humanity humbled. These are classic Armageddon themes. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Isaiah's warnings is that they focus heavily on human pride being shattered. According to Isaiah, humanity eventually reaches a point where its own power can no longer save it. That idea feels disturbingly modern because despite all our technological advancement, civilization remains incredibly vulnerable. One catastrophic war could reshape the planet permanently. One series of escalating events could push humanity into unprecedented fear. Isaiah described people hiding in fear, and that emotional atmosphere matters. The last days are not described merely as political instability. They are described as psychological and spiritual terror. Humanity realizing it cannot fully control the future. Perhaps modern society already feels the beginning of that fear. People fear economic collapse. People fear global war. People fear technological misuse. People fear instability. The modern world feels increasingly anxious. Isaiah's descriptions mirror that emotional atmosphere remarkably well. But perhaps the most unsettling part is that Isaiah repeatedly connected global instability with spiritual rebellion. According to his warnings, humanity's crisis is not merely political, it is moral and spiritual. That means the deeper battle may not simply be between nations. It may be between truth and deception, humility and pride, awareness and blindness. Technological progress cannot solve spiritual decay. If humanity continues drifting further into pride, division, and moral confusion, then Isaiah's warnings become increasingly relevant. What if the warnings were never hidden? What if humanity simply stopped paying attention? Isaiah repeatedly described people ignoring truth while continuing ordinary life as deeper instability quietly grew underneath society. That perfectly describes the modern world. Despite increasing tension, many remain spiritually disconnected. Wars escalate, economic anxiety rises, fear spreads globally, yet billions remain consumed by distraction, entertainment, consumerism, endless noise. Modern society is flooded with information, yet starving for wisdom. Spiritual blindness has become incredibly dangerous because people no longer know how to slow down and reflect. Instead, they escape into distraction. Isaiah warned about people hearing without understanding and seeing without perceiving. Humanity today often sees warning signs but emotionally disconnects from them. People become overwhelmed. They normalize instability. Eventually, they stop taking warnings seriously. That psychological numbness may be one of the greatest spiritual dangers of the last days, because once people become numb enough, they stop preparing spiritually. Many already sense something is wrong. They feel the instability and anxiety, yet instead of seeking truth, they seek comfort. Comfort can become spiritually dangerous when it prevents awareness. Isaiah repeatedly warned about societies becoming spiritually dull, not because truth disappeared, but because people stopped responding to it. Modern society may be reaching that point now. People are exhausted, emotionally drained, distracted, and fearful. Once discernment fades, manipulation becomes easier. Fear controls reactions, emotion replaces wisdom, division intensifies. But Isaiah also described something else. Not everyone would remain spiritually blind. Even during judgment, instability, and fear, Isaiah described people who remained faithful, people who stayed spiritually awake while the world around them became increasingly chaotic. That theme matters deeply today because modern society constantly pulls people toward fear and distraction. It becomes easy to lose perspective, easy to become emotionally consumed by world events, easy to drift into anxiety and hopelessness. But Isaiah repeatedly emphasized trust in God, even during uncertainty. That does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to let fear control the soul. Perhaps that is one of the greatest spiritual battles of the modern age: fear versus faith. The world constantly feeds fear through breaking news, wars, economic anxiety, and political instability. People are emotionally overwhelmed. But Isaiah pointed towards something different: a remnant, people who remain spiritually grounded, people who continue seeking truth, people who refuse to lose clarity. Clarity becomes rare when fear spreads. Isaiah's writings repeatedly emphasize humility, prayer, and awareness. Not panic, not despair, awareness. Many misunderstand biblical prophecy and assume prophecy exists merely to terrify humanity. But prophecy often functions as a warning system, a call to wake up spiritually. Perhaps that's why Isaiah's writings continue resonating thousands of years later. The emotional atmosphere of his prophecies feels increasingly familiar. Human pride, instability, fear, distraction, spiritual blindness, temporary peace, nations trembling. These patterns feel remarkably modern. If humanity recognizes the patterns, then humanity still has an opportunity to respond. But that response begins internally, through prayer, discernment, spiritual awareness, and humility. Those qualities become incredibly important during unstable times. Perhaps the most powerful part of Isaiah's message is this: even when darkness spreads, God remains in control. That truth changes everything, because without hope, prophecy becomes unbearable. Isaiah's writings ultimately point beyond destruction, beyond fear, beyond instability, toward restoration. Maybe the world is not falling apart randomly. Maybe humanity has been warned for thousands of years. Isaiah described trembling nations, fear spreading across humanity, instability, pride, spiritual blindness, and temporary peace collapsing into chaos. Disturbingly, much of that atmosphere feels increasingly familiar today. We explored how Isaiah's warnings extended far beyond his own generation. He described nations in turmoil, societies consumed by fear, humanity trusting fragile systems, people becoming spiritually numb, prideful civilizations collapsing, and a world trembling under instability. We explored why the Middle East remains so important globally,
why conflict there repeatedly affects the entire world, emotionally and politically, and why temporary peace continues collapsing. We explored Isaiah's warnings about spiritual blindness, perhaps the most dangerous condition of all. According to Isaiah, people would continue living normally even while warning signs surrounded them. Modern society reflects that prophecy more than many realize. People are distracted, emotionally exhausted, spiritually overwhelmed. Yet beneath the distractions, many sense something changing. The world feels increasingly unstable. Fear spreads faster, division grows deeper, peace feels more fragile. Isaiah's imagery of trembling nations begins sounding less symbolic and more recognizable. But perhaps the most important part of Isaiah's prophecy was never the destruction itself. It was the invitation to wake up. Biblical prophecy was never only about predicting disaster. It was about revealing truth. Truth about human pride. Truth about spiritual blindness. Truth about humanity's need for God. Humanity continues repeating the same patterns: pride, violence, distraction, false security, fear, and eventually instability. But Isaiah also described hope, a remnant, people who remain spiritually grounded while chaos spreads, people who refuse to lose discernment, people who seek truth instead of distraction. Perhaps that becomes the real dividing line in the last days, not merely politics, not merely nations, but spiritual awareness. Because if humanity continues ignoring warning signs, instability may continue intensifying. And if Isaiah's visions truly point toward the end times, then the world may be moving closer to a moment of enormous global shaking, a moment resembling Armageddon itself. But maybe the greatest question is not whether Isaiah saw the end. Maybe the greatest question is whether humanity will recognize the warning before it's too late.